Hello, everybody out there in podcast and radio world. This is Manuel James Delgado, and you're listening to the Life on Mission podcast powered by Pace. You got yours truly in the studio. And if you just fell upon this podcast, the reason why we call it Life on Mission is because we truly believe that we were created to live life in God's purpose for our life. He says that he comes to give life and life to the fullest. It's not just something far away, but it's for the now. He has a wonderful calling specifically tailored for you. It says in Ephesians 2:10 that you are God's masterpiece and created to do good works that he prepared in advance for you to do. And those works are tailored specifically for you for the now. So I always interview somebody different around the world, and just we hear about their journey, living a life on mission. And most of the people that I get, of course, are on Pace. We get other people too, but today we got someone extremely cool. I won't say too much about him quite yet, other than he's a missionary child. You'll find out what that means right now. Hello, Mr. Josh. How you doing?
Hi, man. I'm good, thank you. And you?
Oh, yes, I am good. The weather's ever changing here on the Faroe Islands, but we do have some sun.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah. My kids, we're going to the States. I'm from California, and we're going to the States in the summer, and they keep on complaining, why can't we be there now? Why did you tell us we're going to California already? You should have just surprised us, because they hate the weather here.
Oh dear. At least they'll enjoy it once they get there.
Yeah, exactly. So those listening, I know you, but can you just give a little brief intro of who you are and why you are where you are in the world?
Sure. So first of all, thanks, Manny, for having me today on the podcast. It's a joy to be here and to share with everyone who's listening, or who will be listening as well. And my name's Josh. I am 28 years old, and I currently live in Brazil. Yeah. I currently live in São Paulo, Brazil. I've been living in Brazil for 7 years now, working full time as a missionary with Pais Movement. I grew up sort of split between France and Northern Ireland. Both my parents are Northern Irish, but they worked, and so they still live in France. They worked as missionaries in France when I was a kid and when I was a teenager. So me and my siblings, we grew up there. We spent some time in Northern Ireland as well, just long enough to get the accent from Northern Ireland.
My wife was asking about that. Is he from? I can't figure out his accent.
Before heading back to France. And so grew up as a missionary kid. My grandparents were missionaries as well on both sides of the family. Wow. And then I ended up serving on Pais after doing my undergrad degree at university, and sort of ended up joining Pais, not entirely on purpose, but
oh, really?
Yeah. I mean, I was finishing my undergrad's degree in classical music, and was starting to think about what my next steps would be, and I wasn't quite ready to do a master's or to think about that sort of thing. I was thinking about it, but I didn't know quite exactly what I wanted to do. So I started looking up at options to spend a year outside of Europe. Basically, I wanted to travel to experience a different culture, but do it in a way that would be useful, that would be through service, and wouldn't just be traveling for the sake of traveling. Mm-hmm. And so I ended up hearing about Pais through a friend at church, and I signed up thinking I was going to take part in this cool social project in Brazil where I was going to be able to play sport with kids and go into schools and give lessons and that sort of thing. But it was only in the first week of training, when they started talking about what it meant to be a missionary, that I realized I'd actually signed up to be a missionary. Until then, I just thought I was taking part in like a gap year social program kind of thing.
God trick.
It all worked out, and I've been here for 7 years now. So,
oh my goodness! And you're leading. You're the national leader right now of Pais,
yes,
Brazil.
So currently leading Pais Brazil, which means that I'm basically responsible for our work in Brazil, across the teams that work in the schools and all our contacts with partner churches, with
Yeah.
donors, recruitment for missionaries that we send to serve in Brazil and in other parts of the world as well. And I've been doing that for almost for 4 years now. I started off on Pais as a team member, going to schools, then a team leader. Then I led the training department for a while, which meant I was responsible for training the missionaries and organizing conferences and that sort of thing. And then in 2020, I ended up stepping into the role of national director for Brazil.
Oh, wow. You went all in. You just dove in. Right on. So, but I'm curious. I'm going to backtrack because you said your grandparents on both sides were also missionaries. Where were they serving with their lives?
Yeah. So on my dad's side of the family, my dad's parents led a missionary organization in the United Kingdom called Faith Mission,
Okay.
and so it was an organization that was focused on reaching people in rural areas. So they would go to, during the week, they would have prayer meetings and organized services in places that were really, there wasn't a local church. That was maybe
Wow.
30 minutes or an hour's drive from a local church, which in some parts of the world that's not very long. So that's
But in
what
others it
a lot
is,
of people
especially in
do.
the rural area.
But exactly, in other places that's a long way. That's a long way to go, especially when you're thinking about families that a lot of them lived off farming and agriculture.
Oh,
So
well, yeah, that's
Sunday
right.
wasn't a day off. Every day was a work day in a certain sense.
Yeah.
So my grandparents, they're an organization that still is active today. That part of what they do, it's not all that they do, but part of what they do
Yeah.
is going during the nights, weeknights, to these more rural areas and running services and Bible studies for
Amazing.
people who don't necessarily have easy access to church services.
Can I be cliche and ask, do they use barns to put on services?
I mean, they actually have, there's what they call mission halls, which have been built all across the UK, which is basically a
Cool.
small hall that people would
That
meet
is
in.
so cool. Right
So
on.
yeah, and then on my mom's side of the family, my grandparents were actually missionaries here in Brazil for 43
Really?
years or something like that. They worked with Oriental Mission Society, and so they worked with Japanese immigrants here in Brazil, and they ran a camp center for a long time. And my mom grew up as a missionary kid in Brazil as well.
What? I mean, that's such a specific ministry in Brazil reaching Japanese people. Wow, that's amazing. And like, it's funny when you talk to missionary kids and pastor kids, you either they're really rebellious to that whole lifestyle when they get older, or they're all in. But there's always this turning point where they make this, what they considered a valid decision to go, left or right. And you just grew up with all of this around you. It was natural, right? But when was the turning point where you realized this is what I want for my life, or I agree with this lifestyle? I'm making a decision that I agree with this lifestyle. How did that happen for you?
I mean, to be honest, it was about 2 years into serving full time on mission. It was a long process. I mean, like, as I mentioned, I grew up in a missionary family, grew up going to church and that sort of thing. But I sort of, God really transformed my heart, and in a certain sense, I guess saved me, or did the work of salvation. I think when I was about 19 years old, I was at university already. I'd spent most of my teenage years and sort of the start of young adult years believing in God, believing in Jesus, but going to church, but not really having a personal relationship with God, not having a routine or discipline of praying, reading the Bible, and that sort of thing. And then, when I was sort of 19, turning 20, God opened my eyes to who He was and to the truth of His gospel and to the needs that I had to hands over my life into His hands. And so then, as I mentioned, my plan at the time, I never even considered doing mission as a teenager. That was something my parents had done. That was something my grandparents had done. But I was all good. I was going to be a classical musician, a professional musician.
Come on.
And then, sort of coming out of university, I wasn't quite sure what direction to take. Started taking interest in serving somewhere for a year as a kind of gap year. Heard about Pais through a friend at church, and ended up signing up. Originally, I wanted to go to India because I wanted to be challenged by the culture that I would live in. And so I was like, what is the most different culture to those that I know in Europe?
That's extreme.
But God ended up opening the doors for me to come to Brazil, which made sense. It didn't. I hadn't thought of it, but it made sense whenever I thought about my grandparents and my mom having grown up here in her childhood and teenage years as well. So I started serving on Pais at the start. I came initially thinking of just spending 1 year here, and then I saw the opportunity that I had to continue sort of investing in the lives of teenagers here in Brazil. I went to Brazil without speaking much Portuguese at all. And so from the start of my first year, from when I arrived, I was already starting to think about potentially staying longer so that I could be more effective in the work and not have a language barrier.
Wow.
I was really concerned that if I stay just 1 year, I'm going to spend the first 6 months learning the language, and then I'll have 6 months to start to do something useful, and then I'll go away again. So that was sort of where the idea came to potentially stay longer, and I enjoyed the work I was doing. I saw that I wanted to help serve as a team leader, leading other missionaries in the work in schools, and so I decided to stay a second year, to work to serve as a team leader during that second year. And during that second year, I came across, I'd already heard of it, but I'd never stopped to read it, a book by Elizabeth Elliot called Through the Gates of Splendor, which tells the story of Jim Elliot, and a group of American missionaries who worked in Ecuador in the 20th century. And it tells the story of the work that they did to reach unreached native communities and tribes in the Amazon rainforest in Ecuador. And I don't know if you know the story, but what happened in the end was that a tribe who was the most violent and the most closed tribe in the region ended up tricking the missionaries, and ended up killing them. I'm not sure how many men. There were maybe 5 or 6 men who were killed by the tribe. And so Elizabeth Elliot was the wife of one of the leaders of the missionary team, who was there on the ground with him as well. Her and the other wives and their kids were at the base whenever the attack happened, and so they weren't harmed. But she tells the story, and I read the book. I'd heard the story before, but as I read the book, I was really sort of impressed and impacted by the full commitment that these men and their families had to serving God's kingdom, to making sure that to reaching unreached people groups, to taking the good news of the gospel to people who'd never heard it before, who didn't speak a language that the Bible had been written in, and in potentially dangerous situations, which ended up these guys ended up giving their lives, quite literally, for the gospel. And so I just remember that as I was reading the book, I would end up stopping sort of between chapters and then just start praying, saying, God, look, I want to have that level of commitment. I want to be willing to go wherever you want to send me and to reach whoever you want me to reach, whether that means in Brazil, whether that means in a city like São Paulo, or whether that means in the middle of nowhere in a foreign country with people that I don't know and that I don't necessarily that I would have to learn to interact with and to reach. And it wasn't that I was asking God to send me there. It was that I think for the first time in my life, I was actually letting go fully of the reins, saying to God, look, wherever you want me to go, I'm willing to go. I don't have any work specific in mind. I'm happy to continue working where I'm working, but sort of felt God use that book to really help open my heart in the sense that that I was willing to be molded by him.
I think that's so interesting. So many people have different ways of God speaking to them. And of course, you know, with my background, I met God in a radical way, and he helped me get out of this addictive lifestyle. But there was this other pivotal point in my life where I didn't really understand, or maybe even know, or knew how to put words on looking at life and God's calling on my life from heaven's perspective. And after having that revelation, it really just changed everything. And it wasn't about dying for him, even though it was more about living for him. And if that meant dying for him, so be it. But what am I going to do with the time that I live? But that moment also came from a book. and you know, a friend just put this book into, you know, When Heaven and Earth Merge, with Bill Johnson. And reading that, I like, same. Every chapter I put it down. I was like, oh my goodness, please God, I need this. I don't want to just read it. I want to live it, you know? And I think that's so amazing, Josh. And I don't know if this is true for you, but when I gave my life back to Jesus and I started doing missions, all the things that I remember my parents doing or saying to me or just experiencing, it all started making a lot more sense. What about you? Because you grew up just seeing the way that your parents were all in and serving and stuff, and you actually made a decision to go and do classical music and get an education and all that. But then God just, you know, really guided you back with his grace into what his purpose was for your life. Did you ever just reflect back to like, okay, that's why, you know, my parents were this way, or I don't know. Did that like just give a different view?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as like with my parents, we ended up moving around quite a bit when I was a kid and was in a teenager. When I was a teenager, and I remember the hardest move was when I was 13 years old, when we moved back after having spent some time on sabbatical in Northern Ireland. That had already been that had been a few years already. Going back to France. Because at that stage I was 13, I was already in middle school. I had my friend group, my group of friends. I had my group of friends at church as well. I was playing sport. I was I was at a stage in life where I was enjoying life and was enjoying everything I was involved in. And then to have to give all that up, not because of something that I wanted, but because of something that my parents wanted.
Oh my goodness, that must have been so hard.
For a 13-year-old boy is so hard to comprehend. And even to the point where I remember we moved by car. We sent a lot of our stuff in a truck to where we were going to live in France. But the actual move, the day we moved, we drove with a trailer on the back of the car. With some of the remaining stuff. And we had to drive down to Dublin in the south of Ireland to get a ferry across to England, to then drive through to Wales, actually, to then drive through Wales and then England, to then get a ferry across to France and drive through France. And I remember as a 13-year-old boy hearing on the radio as we were driving down to Dublin about traffic on the highway, on the motorway. And I remember just praying to God and saying, look, God, let's make us miss the ferry, please. As if missing the ferry would mean that we would give up, that my parents would give up, we would go back home to Northern Ireland. And there were no other ferries going that day or that week. That was the only ferry, which obviously wasn't true. But now as an adult, as someone who's been working in mission for 7 years, I mean, it's there's no hesitation if you understand that it's God's will for you to move, and to uproot your family to go to a different country or a different part of the country or a different part of the world. There's no hesitation. Like, it's not easy. It doesn't mean it's easy, but you don't think twice. I mean, I imagine for those that have kids and stuff, well, then it's an even harder decision to take. But
Yeah.
I mean, when you see clearly that it's God directing you and your family, well, then it's easier, I think, to have conviction in your decision. It's not necessarily easy to take the decision, but it's easier to have conviction
The
than
conviction.
whenever you're
I like
a missionary kid who's just moving because your parents understand that it's God's will for you to move.
Oh, wow, your poor 13-year-old brain. But yeah, so you've been doing full-time ministry missions for 7 years now here in Brazil, and it just seems like it's an exciting country to work in. I've never been there, but you send Brazilians this way, and we for a couple of years now, and both times we had Brazilians and there. So I'm Latin, so I like really connect with them in a different way. It's just so much fun, and just hearing the way that they do birthday parties and just culture and hang out and stuff. It's just exciting. I'm not even trying to be stereotypical, but I hear that they dance at every party. What do you got going on there, and how is what you're doing? How is God using that to transform people's lives in the society that you're in? I just want to hear some stories about what's going on in the now.
Yeah, I mean, Brazil's is an amazing place.
Yeah.
The people are amazing, and the cultures, like, it's very different from Europe, from the other
Oh
cultures that I knew.
yeah.
Also, there's a lot of things in common, but there's also a lot of very different things. I think I'm a very different person today than I was 7 years ago, because Brazilian culture has rubbed off on me. But yeah, in terms of what we're doing here, what God's doing here, I mean, there's a couple of things that really sort of stand out in Brazil, and one of those is sort of, I think, young adults' willingness to invest time into mission. I mean, we see a lot, like you mentioned, some Brazilians that served in the Faroe Islands, and we see a lot of Brazilians who want to serve in mission as young adults, as single people, as married couples, as families as well.
Amazing.
I mean, we see teenagers who at 15 years old say, I want to be a missionary here. And that's not, when I grew up, that was my brother. My brother, when he was a kid, he said he wanted to be a missionary when he grew up. And he was the only person I think I knew around my age or younger who said they wanted to be a missionary. Here, it's not uncommon to meet kids, because, I mean, I think sort of the Brazilian church in general has a really strong heart for mission, both local mission and for transcultural mission.
That's so important. I like that.
So I was just at an event speaking at an event at a church last Saturday, and it was a missions event that was organized by the church with a focus on their young adults ministry. So usually sort of 18 to 25, 28 years old. But there were people of all ages there. There were middle-aged men and women who were asking questions about mission, who were asking, how can I get involved in mission?
Come on. Amen.
As well as the 18, 19-year-old kids who were interested as well, and even some younger ones. So I've had the sort of the privilege over the past few years to see teenagers who, maybe when I met them, were 15, 16 years old, who said that they were interested in mission, they were interested in ministry, grew up and take the step to serve in mission. One of our Pais alumni, a young guy who finished, he spent a year and a half serving with Pais and finished in December of last year, at the end of last year. I actually met him when he was about 15 years old, here through my local church. And he came up to me after the service one day and he said, Josh, I want to learn to do Haverin Bible studies.
Come on. That's so cool.
And I was, so I put him in contact with a team that worked in his church who were running the youth academy and running Bible studies and that sort of thing. And at 17, when he couldn't quite sign up to Pace full time yet, he started to take some time out of his spare time to go into the schools with the Pace team as a volunteer, and was sort of, and did having Bible studies with the Pace team, was sort of mentored by them, and ended up signing up to serve on Pace full time. Spent 6 months as a team member, then became team leader and led a team for a year.
In Brazil.
And yes, in Brazil.
Yeah. Amazing.
And it was just really cool to see this kid who came up to me one day after church saying, "Oh, I want to learn to do having Bible study." He ended up actually leading a school's team for a year and training 2 other missionaries in his team who became team leaders after that. So he multiplied his leadership as well.
What an amazing journey. That's what it's all about too. It's that simple. You just you are available to apply or feed that hunger that the youngster had, and then he went off and multiplied it. People are always asking me, we want to bring discipleship to our church or to our ministry. How do we do that? I'm like, how do you not do it? It's very, very simple. You just, whatever you have, you give. Show them how to do it so that they can go and do likewise and multiply it.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. Beautiful. Nice. Yeah. That's really, really cool to hear.
Yeah. So like we've got there's a number of different, they're now young adults, but people who in different stages over the past few years ended up becoming sort of participating in Pais activities voluntarily. Some of them ended up actually signing up to serve on Pais full time and served on Pais for a year or longer. Others went on to do different things, but are now either at Bible college studying to be missionaries, or to lead churches. And I think one thing that's really cool that we're seeing this year is that some of the same sort of age range of guys who are interested in mission, guys and girls, that we have contact with through the partner church, they're interested in mission, but they're 15, 16, 17 years old. What the Pace team did this year, which I thought was really cool, the schools team that worked in that partner church, was they talked to these teenagers and said, look, we want to really emphasize and really have a focus on connecting kids from the schools to the church this year, and we want your help. So we want you to sign up to join the Youth Academy, not just so that you can learn, but so that you can be a first point of contact for the kids we're going to invite from the schools to take part in having Bible study and that sort of thing. And because you're loved companions, we want you to be their first point of contact at these events so that you can help connect them to church and not just us. And there were just in February, I think there were 4 or 5 guys and girls who said yes to that and who've been taking part every week, and have already started to get other kids who have no contact with church to start taking part in church events.
They're the evangelists, man. You don't have to do anything. Oh, that is so good. We have some youngsters like that. It was so funny. We started my wife and I, before we had Pace, I was doing the pre-teen work, and I only had time to do it every other week. And then when we got a Pace team, then we were able to do it every week. But they were also serving in the local school, and they were just doing organized activities during the free time, and that was it. But some of our youth went to that school. Their friends would play with them, and they would be playing with the Pace team. And then they were curious about the team, and they said, "Hey, are they in your church?" And the kids were like, yeah, they're in our church. We have a youth club. Can we please come? We try and do all of these like crazy tactics to make it like okay for our church kids to invite friends to events, and it's just so awkward when you have something just natural like that, and they're excited for what they're doing in the church, with the Pace team and stuff like that. You don't have to do much. You just have to bring a presence, and at that time there was maybe like 5 or 6 kids going to the youth work at the church. Within a couple of months, it was over 20, and it's never dropped down. Wow. And these kids, and the Pace team's not even in that school anymore. They're in other schools, right? But those kids and their friends are inviting friends, and it's still like the turnover of new people coming in all the time is just amazing. And this was a year and a half ago when that first started. And it's just amazing what we do when we just bring a presence like that.
Yeah.
And believe, like you, they're like, what? You trust me to do this? These kids are like, oh, I can do this too. And you're like, yeah, we want to use you to do this. We believe in you. You got this. They're like, oh, okay. I'm gonna do it. It's amazing. I love it. Yeah. So cool, Josh. So cool. I don't know why. Like in a minute, we're gonna jump into any friendly advice and tools that you would give people. But I just want to hear about you and Jesus right now. Like, what season do you feel you're in right now with God? What is He speaking to you about, and how is that flowing out of what you're doing in your everyday? Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think I'm at quite an interesting place, to be honest. In the sense that over the past few years, I've come to understand, I think, more fully God's grace, in the sense that and the work that Jesus did on the cross, in the sense that for a long time I would practice the disciplines like prayer, like reading the Bible and that sort of thing, because I thought that if I didn't do it, I was losing points with God. And I knew that rationally I was like, yeah, but I know that God covers me with His grace, so it's okay if I fail or something, if I fail in the sense of failure. But I always had a sense that I was doing, even though I had fruitful times of personal disciplines and that sort of thing. It was always with the sense that if I didn't do it, well, then I was losing points with God. It weren't not necessarily points that would make me lose salvation or anything like that, but just points that would make me lose favor with God. That God would look on me and look at me and be disappointed or something like that. And over the past, let's say, probably 2 years or so, I've gradually, through study, through conversations with friends, with different mentors as well, I've gradually managed to wrap my head around the fact that when God looks at me and when He looks at other people that He's called and chosen to be His sons and daughters, He doesn't see us; He sees Jesus.
Amen.
In the sense that Jesus is our advocate. So God looks at us. And I remember actually our young adults pastor, he also mentors me. I think about 2 years ago at a small group meeting, he decided to broach this subject. And he's like, okay, so if you didn't do your devotional today, how many points out of 10 would you give yourself with God? And everybody was like, I don't know, 7, 8. Don't know, I did it yesterday, so I'm good. Like, that's 8 or 9. And he's like, no, it's 10. God looks at you and He sees Jesus advocating for you, so He sees 10 out of 10.
Wow.
And I remember at the time I was like, okay, theologically I get that, but is that really useful to think that way? Because in my head I was like, if I don't feel like I have an obligation to do things, well, then I won't do them and I'll suffer negative consequences just personally, because I haven't been practicing those things. And so, like, I understood the concepts, but in my head I was like, that's not actually, I didn't think it was useful to think that way. I thought it was more useful to think that I had a point system going on with God.
Kept you motivated.
Because then I would feel more motivated. And over the past couple of years, I've gradually I think God's opened maybe just calmed my mind and my heart to understand that no, His grace is complete. That Jesus' blood does cover everything. So my interactions with Him through Bible study, through prayer, through everything else, it's not out of obligation. It's not because if I didn't do it I would lose points. It's not even I mean, obviously, we benefit from that. We grow in that. We're sanctified through those things, but God doesn't look at us less. Wouldn't look at us less if we didn't do it. And that's a really hard thing I think for us as mere human beings to wrap our head around. But what that has also helps me understand is a lot more the sanctity of our life as a whole, of living a full life in God, abundant life in God, which means that being spiritual isn't just, or spiritual moments aren't just when you're interacting with the Bible or with God, or when you're consciously. I mean, on Pais we talk about Kavanagh and the concept of we need to be conscious of God's presence, of God's purpose in what we're doing, and I totally agree with that. But the way I looked at that before was that if I'm not conscious of it, well, then what I'm doing isn't holy, and it doesn't. It's not pleasing God, because I'm not conscious of His presence in what I'm doing, and I'm not conscious of His purpose in what I'm doing. And I've gradually come to understand that no, I can be fully focused in something practical. My mind's fully occupied. I don't have to reserve a little drawer that's constantly, consciously praying, so that I'm fulfilling God's will and pleasing Him. I can be fully involved in something as a human being and be living life abundantly according to God's will, and be glorifying Him in that full experience of the life that He created us to live.
He's not restricted by our consciousness of His presence 100%. It's kind of like, I don't know why I got this picture. I was reading this book called The Shack a while back ago. I read it a couple times, and the one that was playing God the Father was this like African lady, farmer girl from the South, and she was listening to some music that hadn't been created yet, but it was somebody in the future. And it was just really cool to see that like, God, He's just enjoying us, even when we're not even knowing that He's listening to us, because He knows us. He's so proud of us. And he looks at us, and like I said in the beginning of this, we're His masterpiece. And He knows everything about what we're going to do and not do, and when we're going to think of Him and not think of Him. And He's so proud of us, And I think one of the things I love that you're talking about grace, because grace is not just, it's not just like a saving type thing, but it's an empowering type thing. Yeah. So when you have that revelation, like you've been having of the grace, it's actually empowered you to just take the relationship to a whole other level, because it's not dependent on your point system. Right? And that's just, and I don't know, I don't know you day to day, but I do know you, and you do not seem like the lazy type anyways. So for you to say that you were worried about not being motivated, it's just like, just give it a try.
Yeah.
Amen. And who knows, this revelation that you've been pondering and growing and maturing from these last couple of years, who knows if it wasn't meant for a time like this for you to help others also struggling with this, because, we deal with two extremes, I feel, in these different cultures. And you can tell me what it's more like in Brazil, but it's either they are totally against the whole spiritual thing, or it's like just a religious thing. It's what they breathe. And like I said, if they're not reading their Bible, if they're not praying, if they're not all in doing this or that, they're not worthy, and that's just so not true. And we want our young people to thrive in this relationship with God and what God has for them, and not feel like they have to work their butt off to the point where they break down with anxiety and stress, and then they fall away from God from that view. It's just, that really frustrates me. No, breathe Him in. Enjoy the breath of God that just gives life and life to the fullest. So with this short amount of time that we have left, someone comes up to you, Josh, and you could just see the passion in their eyes. They're like, I really want to live my life for Jesus. I want to go and do this and that. Where do I get started? What do I do, Josh? What would you say to that person?
I mean, I think one thing that I've repeated a lot over the past few years, that I think has really helped me as well, is to sort of help them question where, this isn't in a negative sense, but help them question where that passion and where that desire is coming from. Because I was, like I shared a little bit about my story, I kind of fell into serving in mission. Well,
Yeah.
I in my perspective, I kind of fell into it. I see very clearly. I mean, I always remember C.S. Lewis in in his book Surprised by Joy, which tells the story of his personal testimony. He talks about how he sort of perceived God as this inevitable force that was directing him towards itself. That he, in so many different ways, tried to flee from the gospel, tried to flee from the truth of the gospel, and he just couldn't. God had encaptured him, and God was an inevitable force that just drew him to himself. Drew C.S. Lewis to himself. And I think sort of my stepping into mission, I sort of see it in a lot of ways as that. It was inevitable. It was, I mean, it was God who decreed it, God who directed me, and
Wow.
So for a long time, I only thought about that aspect of it. But what I noticed was that in times that I was frustrated or tired, I would blame God for the decisions I had made. In terms of, I would say, look, God, okay, so you called me into this, so it's your responsibility. You have to deal with this and sort this out, and that was never helpful, to think that way. While I sort of, I believe fully in the sovereignty of God, and the fact that He is in control and decrees everything that happens, and the people that He calls, and so in that sense He is inevitable. He gives us, He interacts with us, He works in partnership with us. He gives us space to take decisions, take responsibility for the decisions that we took. And so what I've learned over the past few years as well, since I joined Mission, is that, at least in my experience, it's been a lot more about commitment than about calling. So calling often, now this isn't necessarily the case for everyone, but often we look at calling as that sort of inevitable, God called me, and so I'm just obeying. But the issue is that when we think of it just in that sense, is that when everything starts to go wrong, or whenever we get tired, it's God's fault, because God was the reason that we stepped into it in the first place. So what I've learned to see, and as well to think about as I take steps into the future as well, is that God is directing me to make a decision and to make a commitment. But the person who made that decision, made that commitment, is me. And so I need to take responsibility for that. And that means that whenever things go pear-shaped or aren't going as I expect, at least for me, knowing that God directed me to take a decision, to step into commitment in that, means that the responsibility is also mine. And yes, I can turn to God and ask for help and ask for guidance and all that sort of thing. But God's expecting me to get up and to deal with it, and to deal with whatever issues have arisen, or to sort of persevere through it. God doesn't want disciples who, whenever they face the first step of difficulty, who sit down and cry and say to God, your fault, deal with it. He wants disciples who are going to look up and say that, God, this is a challenge, help me through it,
awesome.
and I'm going to work through it. And so whenever, and I have sort of, whenever I'm invited to share about missions and about calling, the topic of calling always comes up, and I always sort of highlight this, that was my own story, which was I don't see any one moment, even though we talked about sort of certain different moments that were important to me, I don't see any one moment where I say, oh, that was when God called me, or that something. It was God directed me, and there were a series of steps and decisions that I took with God's guidance, because God directed me to take those decisions, because and that helps me whenever we face the challenge that we're going to face in ministry and mission field, and when we get unmotivated and tired and that sort of thing. I'm the one who took the steps to be here. God directed me to do it. God took me here. God brought me here. I took the steps. And I think that's really important for someone who wants to get involved in mission and ministry full time, who's thinking about taking a big decision to step into a big challenge, is to be aware that, yes, okay, God is inevitable, and if it is God's will, it will happen. But God works in partnership with you, and He wants you to step into it and to take responsibility and ownership over that decision, that step that you're taking.
Beautifully put. Turning calling into commitment. I like that. Josh, we have to end. We could go on forever. Thank you so much for joining me. This has been enriching, not just fun to talk to you, but it's been very spiritually enriching. Thank you so much. Thank you out there for joining us here on the Life on Mission podcast. And if you want to learn more about Pais, you can go to pais.life. And look up Pais Brazil and see what they're doing there. We're here on the Faroe Islands. We're all over. And God has a purpose for your life. It says in Romans 12:2 that you can test and approve His good, pleasing, and perfect will for your life. Get tight with God. Find out where He's leading you. And don't just make it look for a calling like Josh is saying here. Make these step-by-step decisions that help you commit to the life and life to the fullest that He has for you. Take care, and we'll see you all next week. Bye-bye.